Hello, and welcome to the episode that nobody asked for. I mentioned once before that I was a sailor, and that's where this whole thing begins. On a spring day in Washington, D.C., along the levee of the Anacostia River, I participated in my first Navy PT session. It's physical training. The Navy usually does it 3 times a week, usually some stretching, warm-ups, and then you go for a run. And at least back then, when we ran in formation, there was usually a thing called a cadence involved. It's like a song or a chant, and it helps you keep time, and it helps you keep everybody in step and on the same page. We sang a lot of different cadences, some for running, some for marching. Steamroller Baby was a good one.
I'm a steamroller, baby. Just a rolling down the line. Just a rolling down the line. I'm a steamroller, baby.
Captain Jack. Tiny Bubbles.
Tiny bubbles, tiny bubbles in my beer. In my beer. Makes me happy. Makes me happy. All through the year. All through the year.
They say that in the Navy. They say that in the Navy, the coffee's mighty fine. It looks like muddy water and tastes like turpentine. But my favorite of all of the cadences was Drunken Sailor. You might be familiar with it. You might have even heard it recently. Because the Drunken Sailor marching cadence that we sing in the Navy has roots that go clear back to the age of sail. It started out life as a sea shanty. And since we all know that sea shanties are so hot right now, I really wanted to talk about them. They've been on my mind. And my first question was, were sea shanties ever a thing here in Bremerton? My initial thought has been no, probably not. Sea shanties are from the era of sail, from sailing ships, and the work that sailing ships required, like turning a capstan, heaving and hauling on lines, raising and lowering sails, loading supplies on board a ship. But Bremerton comes into existence just before the turn of 1900, so that puts it squarely in the age of steam ships, not sail ships. According to Wikipedia, the age of sail ended in the 1860s, which is 30 years before Bremerton would become a twinkle in William Bremer's eye. And Bremerton has always been a Navy base. The Navy officially transitioned from sail to steam in 1895 with the battleships Texas and Maine. But that puts us a lot closer to our founding date. So you kind of have to stop and think about it, almost in the terms of historical fashion. Just because people were converting their ships in the 1860s, it doesn't mean that everyone did right away. It doesn't mean that every ship instantly became a steamship. I'm sure that there were ships still sailing via wind power. So I started to look for some confirmation of that. I started specifically looking for sailing ships known to operate in the Puget Sound. We know we had the Mosquito fleet of ferry boats that ran all over the Puget Sound, but those were all steamboats, so we have to look further back. And that was when I came across a drawing labeled Port Madison. It looks like an ink sketch of a shoreline. There's a steamboat on the water in the foreground with a small town behind it. And off to the right was what intrigued me. It appeared to be a section of docks with a couple of masted sailing ships. Okay, so where in the world is Port Madison? I got my hands on the book Port Madison, Washington Territory by Freddie Perry. Inside is an 1856 land survey of Port Madison. The shape seemed familiar, so I held it up next to Google Maps to confirm, and it looks like Port Madison is the north end of Bainbridge Island. The story goes that in April of 1853, the first steam-powered sawmill in the Puget Sound started in Apple Tree Cove. which would be modern Kingston. There are differing accounts as to who moved the mill and why, but either way, by 1855, that mill had been moved to Port Madison. It particularly mentions that a group of men came up to Apple Tree Cove on the brig John Davis, and I found some corresponding shipping records that the John Davis returned to the port of San Francisco on July 30th, 1853, with a load of lumber and 3 passengers. It returned to San Francisco again from the Puget Sound with loads of lumber, piles, and shingles on October 5th. There is also mention of the brig Merchantman leaving for the Puget Sound on March 26th of 1856, and it looks like the brig Consort made the trip a couple of times too. And so, what kind of ship is a brig, you might ask? And a brig is a 2-masted sailing ship. It was a versatile style of ship. It was used by merchants and the military and even whalers. When you think of a sailing ship with its glorious sails billowing in the wind, there's a good chance that you're picturing a brig. And where there are sails, there are shanties. So, if the ships are making it to the north end of Bainbridge, I think it's possible that they sailed down the Agate Passage or even around and down into the Port Washington Narrows. And that's good enough for me. Were there shanties sung on the Puget Sound? I think that answer is a resounding yes. And my next question was, well, what shanties did they sing? That's a much more difficult question to answer. Shanties could be carried all over the world by different sailors as they signed on to work on different vessels. Some shanties make geographic references, but obviously none to Bremerton, of all places. There are some specifically American shanties, like Blow Boys Blow from the Atlantic coast.
Yankee ship come down the river, blow, boys, blow.
We also find that the lyrics to shanties change geographically, like in Homeward Bound, which could be sung with a reference to Frisco Town. I think there's a good chance that a shanty like Homeward Bound would have been heard on the Puget Sound, as one of the aforementioned brigs started heading home to San Francisco from Port Madison with a load of timber. All of this, of course, is a lot of speculation. Take it with a grain of salt. The one thing that I can say for sure is that sailors in the United States Navy have probably been singing Reading cadence, full of shanties, the same way that I did along the banks of the Anacostia River. So, has Drunken Sailor been sung here? Absolutely. Probably by some very, very hungover sailors at morning PT. Do you have a question about Bremerton or its history? I want to hear it. You can find the show on social media at Bremelore or visit the website www.bremelore.wtf. That's right, you heard me. Bremelore.whiskey tango foxtrot to leave me a voice message. I can't wait to hear from you.